vitamin D synthesis and photocarcinogenesis. What's the right balance for sun exposure? Ultraviolet radiation is a carcinogen. Sun exposure is the major environmental cause of skin cancer. BCC, SCC. Melanoma. International Agency for Research on Cancer, 1992. National Toxicology Program, Report on Carcinogens, 2000, 2002. Skin cancer is common. Greater than 80,000 Canadians were diagnosed with skin cancer in 2005, one-third of new cancers. Source: Canadian Cancer Statistics 2005, and is becoming more common. Melanoma incidence and mortality rates have risen 2 to 3-fold in 30 years. Melanoma incidence and mortality, Ontario, 1971 to 2002. Source: Cancer Care Ontario, Ontario Cancer Registry, 2004. 3-year moving averages standardized to the Canadian 1991 population. Ambient UV, type and amount of exposure and susceptibility determine risk. Skin cancer risk is higher in susceptible populations living closer to the equator. The higher the total lifetime amount of UV exposure, the greater the risk of skin cancer. An intermittent pattern of intense exposure appears to increase the risk of melanoma. People with sun-sensitive skin, i.e., burn easily, tan poorly, blue eyes, many nevi are at greater risk of developing skin cancer. UV, DNA damage. Cyclobutane pyrimidine dimers, signature mutation. 6,4 pyrimidine photoproducts. Single-strand breaks. DNA protein crosslinks. UV, membrane damage. Lipid peroxidation. Activation of surface receptors with induction of multiple signal transduction pathways, alteration in activation of many cellular proteins, alteration in gene expression and cellular function. UV induces an alteration in immune surveillance. Decreased ability to eliminate cancerous growths. Interference with development of contact hypersensitivity. Public health message: sun protection/skin cancer prevention. Shade. Clothing. Education. Public policy. Sunscreen use. Vitamin D definitions. Vitamin D, UVB-induced production in the skin. Vitamin D and bones. Vitamin D and other disorders. Public health message. Definitions: 7-dehydrocholesterol, provitamin D3. Pre-vitamin D3, cholecalciferol. Vitamin D3, produced in the skin from irradiated 7-DHC, isomerized pre-vitamin D3. Vitamin D2, from plants, from irradiated ergosterol. Vitamin D synthesis. Definitions: Vitamin D3 is hydroxylated in the liver. 25O vitamin D, inactive, measured in serum as the biomarker of vitamin D status from all sources. Second hydroxylation. 1,25O2 vitamin D in the kidney. These hydroxylation steps can also occur in keratinocytes, prostate cells and others. 1,25O2 vitamin D serum levels are tightly regulated. Do not vary by latitude. Sources of vitamin D: sunlight, UVB, food, vitamin D3 and vitamin D2. Fortification of foods: milk, orange juice. Dietary supplements. Action spectra. UVB is the waveband required for vitamin D synthesis. The action spectra for sunburn, cyclobutane pyridine dimers all peak in the UVB range. With longer UVB exposure, vitamin D synthesis does not continue, but DNA damage does. Function of vitamin D increases calcium absorption from the gut. Calcium homeostasis. Maintenance of bone mineral density. Vitamin D deficiency. Rickets. Osteomalacia. Vitamin D insufficiency. 25O vitamin D level. Optimal concentration remains undecided. in a meta-analysis of fracture prevention in the elderly, showed that fracture prevention was greatest when 25O vitamin D levels were 100 nmol/L. These studies used oral supplementation. This required vitamin D intakes of 700 to 800 IU/day, higher than currently recommended doses. People at risk for low 25O vitamin D. Elderly. Northern latitudes in winter. Black skin, melanin. Cultural or lifestyle choices. Sun avoiders, post-organ transplant. 2005 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Individuals at high risk, older adults, people with dark skin, those with little sunlight exposure, should consume extra vitamin D from fortified foods or supplements. Recommendation of 25 micrograms, 1000 IU, vitamin D daily to maintain adequate 25O vitamin D. Do not use UV exposure to obtain additional vitamin D. Johnson M.A. et al. Nutrev 64-410, 2006. Vitamin D supplementation. Prevention of fractures in the elderly. Prevention of falls in the elderly. Prevention of periodontal disease in the elderly. Colorectal neoplasia. Epidemiologic data are generally consistent with the protective effect of a higher 25OD concentration and higher vitamin D intake. The biologic basis for the sensitivity of digestive malignancies to vitamin D status is unclear. Randomized control studies are needed. Bischoff Ferrari H. et al. Amjaclin Nutra 8418, 2006. Jaivanuk Cancer Epidemial Biomarkers Prev 15-2467, 2006. Prostate and breast cancer. Studies have shown geographic gradients in risk. Case control studies and cohort studies have shown a decreased risk of these diseases with increased sunlight exposure. Hypothesis generating: is it the vitamin D that is protective? The potential for cancer prevention by oral intake of vitamin D must be tested in clinical trials. Vander E. H. J. et al. J. Cancer 42-2222, 2006. Gallagher R. P. et al. Lancet Oncology 6-634, 2005. Epidemiologic studies. Less evidence exists for a role for sunlight in multiple sclerosis, diabetes. Life is not so simple. Vitamin D is important for bone health. There is some data supporting vitamin D as protective against certain diseases. Agreement on appropriate levels of 25O vitamin D have not been established. Sunlight, a source of vitamin D, is a carcinogen. What to do? Some advocate for increased unprotected UV exposure. This advice is complex, latitude, weather-dependent, time of day and season. It will not be effective in higher latitudes during the winter. It is inefficient in the elderly, blacks. Many people, such as teenagers, many adults, already are exposed to enough unprotected UV exposure that more UV exposure will not be helpful. What to do? Many advocate for taking vitamin D supplements. Advocate for increased fortification of foods where it is not in place. What to do? Many people do not avoid the sun, and produce adequate vitamin D in the skin depending on the time of year. Incidental sun exposure throughout the year likely produces adequate vitamin D in the skin for many people. Vitamin D supplementation for those at increased risk. What to do? Further research on the role of sunlight and vitamin D in cancer prevention. Randomized controlled trials of dietary vitamin D as a cancer prevention agent. Sun protection messages. Remains important. Prevention of skin cancer and photoaging. Protection using hats, clothing, shade and sunscreen during leisure time/occupational exposure. Standard use of sunscreens has not caused vitamin D deficiency. Marks R. et al. Arch Dermatol 131-415, 1995. Wolpowitz D. et al. J. M. Acad Dermatol 54-301, 2006.